from a great family. We were a big family. All my siblings before me were very successful academically. I was also into sports, so I was kind of having success at school, not only with the school work, but also with the sports. And I was extroverted, so I had a lot of friends. So it wasn't someone who was per se lost, but I can say this, and I say it to a lot of people. I go, if you don't really have a game plan or haven't really discovered a passion in your life, on some level you're always kind of wondering what you're going to do, and you've been kind of given some assets that you feel you want to make the most of. But if you don't really know where to direct them, you're curious. And if you meet someone who is very excited about their game plan, and it certainly sounds a lot better than your no plan, you'll be receptive to hear a little bit more about it. And that's kind of how it began with Freddie. He was very excited about this type of work that he was doing in this spiritual realm. And, you got to remember, this is the late 70s, early 80s, and that whole New Age thing was just blossoming. And I think, a lot of the very traditional religions people had gotten a little bit tired of, and that's really as innocently as it began.
So it must have been around that age, just going to university, that you got spotted by a model agency.
Yeah, it was actually when I was up there visiting Freddie that someone saw me, because one of the guys who was part of his entourage was an actor, and he had a commercial agent. And Freddie said, you should go with him as a friend and just hang out in the lobby, and I'm sure they'll take interest in you. That's literally how it happened. I was literally sitting in the lobby, and the agent kind of went back to get my friend, and then he's like, are you here for an appointment? I said, no, I'm just here with my friend. I'm just waiting. He's like, well, are you an actor? I said, no, I'm a football player. And he's like, well, you've got a great look. It's the first time I heard that. You got a great look. And have you ever considered acting? I'm like, no, I really haven't. But that's how it kind of started.
Did you really not know you were handsome?
Well, I'll put it this way. I never pictured myself as handsome, going through high school. I always felt a little bit too skinny, a little bit too brainy, a little bit, tending towards the geeky type side. I loved all the sci-fi stuff and that sort of thing. And, I wanted to be kind of within the popular crew, but I always felt like I was a little bit on the outside looking in. Sports certainly gave me a foot in with the guys, but I was very kind of insecure around the girls. And so I thought a lot of that was because I just wasn't good enough. And it really wasn't until college where I realized I started to fill out a little bit and gain a little more confidence in a social environment that people seemed to find me attractive. But I never looked in the mirror and said, you should be a model. I never even looked at it that way. But when football went south, in the sense that my injuries started to cause me too many problems that I couldn't really play anymore, I went through basically an identity crisis. That was really the turning point when if you want to say, the hooks went in regard to Freddie, when I was kind of at this life crisis of, I couldn't play football anymore, and that was so tied to my identity. I mean, all my roommates were football players. I'd played football, for 10 years at that point, and if you had met me, I would have said I'm a football player from Princeton. I wouldn't just say I was a student. That's who I was, a football player. So that's when Freddie said you should, start spending time in New York and do this commercial and modeling thing, and you could have a great success, as an actor and a model. And so I guess, when you're 20, 21 years old and don't really know how to make a really qualified decision, I'm like, well, if I can't be a star on the football field, I guess I'll just try to be a star. And that was literally the mentality of which I entered into that field, thinking, well, I got to do something.
How quickly did you rise up the modeling ranks?
Well, that I was very fortunate about. 3 weeks after I'd kind of started working with an agency called Ford.
The really famous one.
Yeah, exactly. Eileen and Jerry Ford. They got me an appointment with Bruce Weber, who was kind of the star-making photographer at that time. And it was just known that Bruce loved finding people that were kind of raw and unknown and never really done this career and launching their careers. And that's exactly what he did with me. Then kind of the red carpet gets, pulled out for you, and things kind of moved from there in a very, very accelerated and easy fashion. So it was the type of thing that when I would go to Europe, quite often the routine was, as an up-and-coming model, you would go to Europe to try to find work and get some lodging. But because I had already kind of been discovered in New York by Bruce Weber, I would go to Italy or Milan to kind of, do a job, and then I'd find all these other guys who were over there starving and struggling, trying to break in, and I used to feel awful about, like, God, how come they're, having to work so hard to get into this business, and it literally fell in my lap. So I remember many times just buying these guys dinners and things and just trying to encourage them to kind of, hopefully get through and break out, because I had no reason in my mind of why I was any different than they were. It was kind of a crazy thing.
Were you still going to university at this stage?
Yeah, I was. It definitely started to taper off my focus towards university. Because of the success I was having, it seemed to be a no-brainer that, well, once I graduate university, I'm just going to move right in here to New York and start, just pursuing this thing full-time, because I could make a ton of money and travel and be around beautiful girls. I mean, there really didn't seem to be a downside. But it was all also tied into the fact that I already had a place where I could stay. Freddie had said I could crash at his apartment until I kind of get, things, figured out. And so all of a sudden I had a future. I had a plan. I knew what I was going to do, and that's how it kind of unfolded.
How did it come about that you started giving your money to Freddie and to his
Well, that's an interesting, phenomenon, in the sense that in the beginning he was incredibly generous and offered, like I said, his place for me to crash and get us all into Studio 54 for free. And I didn't have money to throw around. But then when I moved into the apartment, obviously he wanted me to pay my my share of rent, and that was fine. It was kind of a mini ashram, in the sense that it was a small apartment. There was only one bedroom, and he stayed in the bedroom, and then in the outer living room dining area was we would just roll out mats every night, and there'd be, depending on who was around, 3 or 4 or 5 people rolling out a 1-inch futon and sleeping on the floor. That was my way of sleeping, and it became my way of sleeping. Even when I started making money, I still slept on the mat on the floor. It's kind of crazy when you think about it from that point of view of, I'd hop off the Concorde, come back to the apartment, and roll out my mat and sleep, after staying in a 5-star hotel, maybe in Paris or Milan or London, As I started making more money, it was very clear that I had to attribute my success to Frederick's introduction to the business, and that there was obviously things that need to be paid for, as far as we were starting to expand our business, as far as we had a cable television show. Freddie would go on the radio. He was giving small lectures around. So we were starting to build kind of a business of sorts, and those things needed some funding. So I was happy to contribute, and it just kind of unfolded like that. And Freddie, manipulated me in a wonderful, savvy way of always saying, "Oh, Lord H." That was my nickname. He goes, "Oh, Lord H, you're just impossible, but your generosity will save you in the end." So I had this system in my mind, thinking, well, as long as I keep contributing, then I'll be okay. And as I think anyone who's ever been in a position to be generous, it's a great place to be able to kind of give things away to people without expecting anything in return. And that was kind of the cycle, the way it unfolded. And pretty much, after a short period of time, I would only take the money that I would make from the modeling and put aside enough just to pay my bills, and I would hand everything else I made over. And that just became the way it was my life.
Why Lord H, by the way?
Well, he tended to emphatically enhance everyone's self-image by calling you dukes and duchesses, lords and ladies, that sort of thing. He would refer to you, "Oh, your majesty," and "Oh, yes, princess," and that sort of thing. So he had a way of kind of inflating everyone's persona through flattery, and that was just his way of talking. I don't know whether he just couldn't remember names very well or what, but that was always his way. And there was a certain charm to it, the way he would do it. But he was always kind of putting you up on a pedestal.
Toll-free number. We've got wide open phone lines for you with your scriptural apologetics questions. If you ever this.
So when you find, I think, and you can test this out for yourself, when you find it being said that somebody in the Bible, beginning with John 1,
is the day to make that phone call. 833-288-EWTN. It's a free phone call anywhere in North America. 833-288-3999. 986. If you're outside the United States and Canada, you can give us a call at 205-271-2985. And you can always send us an email, openline@EWTN.com, or you can text your question to John. Text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for a response. Text your first name and your question message, and data rates may apply. So, how do you know that the Catholic Church's list of books are the correct list of books?
Well, here's the thing. Some people say exactly what you're getting at is that, well, the Catholics, it's as illogical because you say, well, here in the Bible,
once this book came out that was called Aliens Among Us, that basically gave Freddie street cred that what he was doing. Astrological readings for them, and it was this whole thing that's when we really became a cult.
When you'd met him, he'd been talking about Eastern philosophy and so on, and at some point over time, he starts talking not and more about aliens and aliens coming to Earth and some kind of millennium. And did you buy all of that?
Yeah. Well, looking back at it, it's hard to swallow to think I did, but unfortunately, yes, I did.
The Earth will tilt the axis. The axis itself does not change. The magnetic poles will shift, the plates snap. In the year 1999, and all the present continents that exist, as they exist in their present form today, 150 miles inland will be submerged beneath the water within 6 hours, and humanity will be decimated. As a matter of fact, the last president of the century will be awoken and will prepare the multitudes for the horrendous times ahead.
That type of material isn't something that he would launch into as an introductory conversation. That was kind of like you see with a lot of these groups. The more sensitive and more fantastical nature of that information comes kind of as a reward of you hanging around long enough to kind of find out the secret truths of what's going on. So the best way for me to describe it is it's kind of like the technique you use to actually boil a frog. If you throw a frog in hot water, it'll jump right out. But if you throw a frog into room temperature water and then slowly, incrementally turn up the heat, it'll stay in there until it boils. And that's kind of what ends up happening with these type of situations. You're exposed to something, you feel like you're meeting some like-minded people, there's this altruistic vibe, you're going to be stronger as a group than you could ever do as an individual. Coming from sports, I love team sports, so I was like thrilled to be part of this team that seemed that we were going to do something really positive with the world. And then Freddie starts unfolding this plan that actually, the world's going to come to this like apocalyptic future that's going to knock out 99% of the population, and that the work that he's doing and his group around him will be actually to pick up the pieces and kind of move into a golden age of the next chapter. And so this is the type of thing that, I don't care how much of an egomaniac you are of thinking and ambitious of thinking you might become CEO of a company or president of the United States or a pro athlete or a movie star. Like, those are realistic within the realms of huge ambition, but you never think you're going to be part of a group that's going to somehow rewrite the fabric of history and start a whole nother age, kind of living a life like a Jesus did. I mean, that's just nothing that enters into your psyche. So when it gets presented to you over time in the way that it was to me, you start believing, well, God, I guess I never dreamed I'd ever have this opportunity. I guess this is really what I'm supposed to do with my life. I never thought something like this would ever come across my mantle to even consider.
How are you and the others going to move into this golden age?
Well, this is where it got interesting. So some of these groups do have sci-fi aspects to them, and we did as well. I mean, I cringe when I think about, Freddie used to talk about how the space people, he was in touch with the space people, and that at the time of these catastrophes, there were going to be all sorts of storms and tsunamis and hurricanes and earthquakes, and then the governments were going to collapse, but then the space people were going to take the few selected of us and lift us out of here so that we could be trained and rejuvenated and then put back on here after the aftermath to kind of start the new age. And, you would have thought I would have at least questioned, like, who these aliens were and, where they were from and, like, how do we know they're good ones? But when you're caught up in this whole kind of brainwashing type of thing, you feel like the person who's leading the charge is going to let you know when you need to know. And the idea of questioning too much quickly gets beaten out of you in the sense that if you ask too many questions, you're kind of put in the category of someone who's a non-believer. So your critical thinking gets eroded pretty quickly, and you just want to be a part of this thing so that you can say that you might make a difference. I mean, I remember literally going into the tanning machines in New York, blasting my face so I was always incredibly tan, because Freddie was always tan, for my job as a model, thinking, well, it's always it's always better showing up, looking tan and healthy. And people were saying to myself, don't you think you're maybe overdoing it? You might damage your skin. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, hey, you don't know this, but I'm going to be put in the rejuvenation chamber once the space people come, so I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And that's literally how skewed my mindset was.
We're going to take a short break now. After the news, we'll find out what happened when Hoyt did start asking awkward questions and why he had to give up modelling for a while. Don't go away.
This is the BBC World Service, where Maria Margaronis takes us to Alabama in the United States.
Now I can look back and see where there's a lot of hardship, but whatever we had was good stuff.
Bend, a tiny hamlet, almost completely cut off by a loop in the Alabama River. A former cotton plantation where women have passed down traditions from mother to daughter for generations.
When I made my first quilt, I was 11 years old, and it was made from old clothes. I've been doing this 40-some-odd years.
Here they've always made quilts out of worn-out clothes. Now they're sharing their skills and their wisdom with other women too.
It's a good place to leave your burdens, and so that's what I'm feeling here. It's not that I'm dredging something up, but that I'm healing something by putting this all together.
Stitching Souls, Sunday at 13 GMT.
Coming up after the international news, part 2 of Hoyt Richards' story. The supermodel has fallen under the influence of an older man who believes aliens will invade the Earth. His family is in despair.
My mother was the first to diagnose it was something dangerous and actually to use the label cult. And I was insulted that she would ever think I would get involved with the cult. And then within, I'd say, a couple of years, I basically broke all contact with my parents. I didn't see them for 12 years.
Outlook's back after this.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. The number of people around the world who've been infected with the coronavirus has now passed 20 million. The Johns Hopkins University says more than a quarter of all cases have been recorded in the United States. Brazil and India are also seeing big rises in cases. Governments around the world have been trying to balance an easing of lockdown restrictions against further surges in the number of victims. President Trump has praised the actions of the security service after an armed suspect was shot near the White House, prompting officers to abruptly remove him from a news conference. Mr. Trump was in mid-sentence addressing journalists when he was approached by a Secret Service agent and escorted from the podium. Minutes later, he returned and told reporters that an armed suspect had been shot and taken to hospital. Police in Belarus say a demonstrator has died in the second night of protests after Sunday's disputed election victory for President Alexander Lukashenko. They say an explosive device went off in the man's hands as he tried to throw it at police in the capital, Minsk. The Lebanese government has resigned following last Tuesday's disastrous explosion in Beirut. In an angry televised address, the Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, blamed a corrupt political establishment for the country's many problems. The security forces in Nigeria have arrested 8 people suspected of involvement in recent attacks in the northwestern state of Kaduna. The arrests follow a series of deadly attacks in the region in the past week, in which more than 30 people have been killed. A new report says that as temperatures rise, peatlands around the world will become a huge source of greenhouse gases. Scientists believe that as icy peatlands thaw, the carbon emitted through melting and from losses of peat into rivers will be up to 50% more than previously predicted. And that's the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jo Fidgen, and you're tuned to Outlook. How does a well-educated, well-adjusted supermodel come to be part of a doomsday cult that thinks they'll be the sole survivors of a catastrophic global event? We've been hearing from Hoyt Richards, who found himself living a surreal double life in the 80s and 90s, treading the catwalks of Paris, Milan and London, while giving all his earnings to a group called Eternal Values. When we left him, he was explaining how he came to accept their wackier ideas, but there was a hefty price to be paid, as we'll hear.
Unbeknownst to myself, I was kind of a recruiter, so I'd kind of brought in a couple of friends of mine from school, and I still had other friends from school that were around, and then obviously I'd met, models and people in New York, but it was frowned upon to really have any real group outside the circle, any friend group, so to speak. And yet, because I was naturally kind of extroverted, I did maintain these relationships, and I felt I really couldn't be transparent about that because I didn't want the group to know that I had people on the outside that I really did care about and enjoyed interacting with. With those people on the outside, as far as telling them what was going on in the inside circle, I didn't do that either. So, the crazy part about the double life that I lived for so long was I just felt like I was lying to everybody on some level all the time. It's a horrible existence, and I don't recommend that to anyone.
What about family? They missed the spot is that something was changing.
Yes, my family, and in particular my mother, was the first to diagnose it was something dangerous and actually to use the label cult. She had recognized that my behavior was changing. We had kind of a confrontational relationship growing up anyway. It just added to, a little salt in the wounds that we were taking a different belief system. She immediately wanted to label it as cult, and I was insulted that she would ever think I would get involved with the cult. The way it kind of crescendoed was my roommates at college were also getting a little concerned because I was basically being told by the group to pull away from my family, and they had noticed me doing some different behavioral things. I was eating a vegetarian diet then. I wasn't drinking and partying as much as I used to. My room is a specific color that Frederick had recommended. I had
what color?
All this a Twilight Chimes. It's kind of a purple violet type color. Even though I was doing things that were different, they didn't necessarily think it was dangerous, and they thought whatever it was, I could definitely handle it. So they weren't alarmed, but when they saw me kind of pulling away from my family, that's when they did get concerned. And it ended up we had a big powwow in our dorm room with my parents. My brother was there, my roommates, and then three of the guys from the group, Eternal Values, had come down to kind of speak on the behalf of the group to say that this wasn't something dangerous. It didn't accomplish much other than clearly state that we were on two different sides of the fence, and that neither side was really that willing to listen to the other side.
So where did that leave your relationship with your family then?
Well, it was tense. My visitations to home just lessened and lessened. And then within, I'd say, like a couple years, I basically broke all contact with my parents and I didn't see them for 12 years.
You mentioned that you'd become vegetarian, that you weren't drinking so much, that you had a purple room. I mean,
yes.
Did Freddie ever explain why purple?
Basically, in the same way that musical notes kind of can be put together in a certain kind of harmonious way, so could colors. The way you carried yourself, the colors you wore, the colors you surrounded yourself with, would basically compensate your weaknesses and enhances your strengths. And this was a color, because of where the planets were at that time, was supposed to be the most advantageous color to surround yourself with. And gems was also part of the scheme of what we got involved with the Eternal Values. Is Frederick claimed wearing the proper precious gem that would touch your skin would affect your physical and spiritual being. And so we were all given kind of a gem prescription that he would come up with just conveniently on his own by looking at your astrological chart, and then you were expected to find the means to pay for those and wear those, and that was part of the uniform that we all kind of participated in.
How expensive were these gems?
I spent probably just under $200,000 on the gems.
Wow.
And then came to find out that they weren't really real.
In 1990, so more than a decade after you met Freddie, he died of an AIDS-related illness. And an article came out at about the same time, I think, in Vanity Fair, which was exposing him and calling this a cult. Do you remember reading that article?
Oh, yes. I do remember in looking at it, I was so caught up in that brainwashed mindset that I wasn't really willing to accept that a lot of what the article was portraying was true. I just looked at it as some smear campaign. They're throwing my friend under the bus, and I have to stand up and stand, in his defense.
What prompted you to start asking awkward questions of other members of the group?
It got difficult for me after Freddie died because those of us who remained, there was a lot of pent-up resentment towards me of the preferential treatment. And now that we were moving down to North Carolina, where we had a compound that Frederick had always kind of said that was going to be a place that would survive the millennium. And since Freddie had died, and we all felt he had died early only because we had put so much heavy karma on him, we basically killed him. Now we have to pay the penalty that we're not going to potentially survive the millennium, and that we don't have contact to the space people, so there's no way they're going to take us out of here, so we have to plan on surviving.
What kinds of questions did you start asking?
I'm still traveling around the world, Paris, Milan, and London, and looking around saying, I just don't see these things happening. There's no earthquakes, really. There's no great tsunamis and, catastrophes happening. Governments are still going pretty steady. So on some level, my critical thinking was starting to kick back in again.
So this was in the run-up to the millennium then?
Yeah, that's right. And so I started to say, I think the timeline's off with this. I don't think... And so I got painted as being a blasphemer or a heretic of sorts, and that's where the dictate basically came down to save Hoyt from himself. I was going to have to be told I couldn't model anymore, and I was going to have to come down and work at the compound with everybody else in North Carolina. And I wasn't really thrilled at that idea, and because I started to, was kind of starting to question everything at that point, it became a little bit more harsh. They started shaving my head every week, so I had a bald skull cap. I couldn't really model it, because back then bald was not beautiful. It wasn't very in vogue to have no hair. And so I was, basically quarantined to the lake compound, and I had to be the first one up and the last one to bed and do every type of slave-like labor to teach me humility. Obviously, I'm looking in the mirror and I think, God, I look like a convict. How did I end up here at this place? I could have been right now, like in Milan, doing a job with Claudia Schiffer or Naomi Campbell, making $20,000 a day. I'd rather be doing that than scrubbing the toilet right now. I guess I'm not spiritual. I guess I really am as full of it as they've been telling me for the last 20 years. And every night for about 9 weeks, I'd face a verbal firing squad of anywhere from 10 to 15 people that would literally verbally assault me on how I'd been resistant and resentful that day to my chores, and they're trying to save me from myself, and I'm just impossible. And it would go on sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 12 hours, and that's when I just, started to think that I was losing my mind.
But, could you not just walk out of there?
Yeah, God, looking back at it, you just think you would, right? But the thing is, it's like any abusive relationship. It's like the wife battering scenario. You've been so convinced that your perpetrators are the correct ones, and it's that type of thing of where they don't want to do this, but because you yourself are so toxic and terrible, you're having to force them to do behavior that they don't want to do. So it's all your fault.
So you took the verbal batterings and you took the head shaving because you felt you deserved it in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I thought, and eventually the only reason I finally escaped and left, and it took me 3 attempts, they caught me twice, the only way I finally got out of there was to come up with the convoluted thinking of, I am broken and unfixable, but because they are committed to this cause, they're never going to stop trying to help someone like me. But I can see without question I am a lost cause and a hopeless case. So the least I can do is relieve them of my dead weight so that they can spend all this time that's being wasted on me and do something far more constructive with their lives, and I can stop burdening them with my presence. And that's how I left.
So how did it happen afterwards then, that you went from this mental state of thinking that you were too bad a person even to be with them, to thinking, actually, you know what, they've been doing the bad thing to me?
Well, that process took about 1.5 years, and it's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I went into a deep depression, and I thought, I turned my back on God and the cause, and I thought, for sure, I'm going to either be hit by a truck or struck down by lightning. Somewhere I'm just going to die some horrific death because I deserve it, because I've literally just betrayed God and everything that's supposed to, we're supposed to stand for. So in that depression, I just, I ended up moving out to California. I moved in with my buddy Fabio because I didn't have any money. He, in a very generous way, just said, listen, you can stay here as long as you want, and let me just crash at his place for about a year. My general perception was, well, no one's ever going to understand this, what I was involved with. It's too special, it's too particular, they're going to think I'm crazy. But the one thing that I was clear that people had from afar labeled it was a cult, and I'm like, you know what, there's no way it's a cult, because I would never join a cult. But the truth was, I didn't really know anything about cults. I wanted to just research cults, just literally so I could cross it off the list. Like, I know it's not that, but let me at least look into it so I can, with confidence, cross it off the list. Then I found this book by Steve Hassan called Combating Cult Mind Control, and he had been involved with this group, and I'm like, well, that's a cult, but I mean, I would never get involved with something like that, and it certainly wasn't what my group was like. So the first maybe 60, 70 pages, his description of how he had been indoctrinated into the group. And that was when the shoe dropped. And that's where, along with my jaw, of recognizing that you could literally have just changed the names, and it was my exact experience. And so this thing that I felt I could never communicate or relay to anyone, all of a sudden I had to swallow the pill of going, no, actually, you were in a cult, and you're just a textbook cult victim.
When you accepted then that you had been in a cult, how did that make you feel about yourself?
Not very good. I was like, oh my God, how could I be so stupid? How could I be so gullible? How could I be so naive? I'm just a moron. All those very destructive places. There's actually a cult recovery place out in Ohio. I don't know if it still exists, called the Wellspring. And I went there. It's kind of like a cult rehab place. And to literally have the physiology of what my experience was explained on a chalkboard was incredibly liberating for me, because that was the only way I began to forgive myself and start to recognize that this experience was not because of some flaw that I had, which is really what the brainwashing is all about, always making you feel that you're lesser than and you're not good enough. It was just that I had been caught in a really unhealthy environment and behaved no differently than anyone would, just trying to survive that environment.
When the shame faded, what replaced it?
I had a lot of suppressed anger from a lot of the treatment, that I encountered over the years, because it was just flat out abuse. So I got very angry. I started to call them up and say, you guys are in a cult, you're all brainwashed, you don't know what you're doing, you don't realize what's going on. And of course it was falling on deaf ears, but it was very healing for me to kind of verbalize and kind of get out all this, anger I had inside. Because, they were living in a house that I had paid for. They had businesses that they were running that I had financed, and I was struggling to pay our rent. And I was like, this is not sitting well with me. So I was lucky enough that I was able to build a case against them and take down what was left of the group and liquidate everything, and the group ended, quite quickly, and everyone kind of ran for the hills.
It must have helped you, though, to know that you brought that group to a close by basically...
Absolutely. It helped me enormously, but the other side of it that's more important, it was to start moving down the path of my own recovery and self-healing, because you don't want to just take the cause you had and replace it by, I'm going to take on the new cause of taking down this group. They're a cult. You need to also do the self-healing. That's what's critical.
You said that you cut off contact with your family pretty much. You didn't speak to them for 12 years. How did it go when you made contact with them again?
After I figured out it was a cult, there were a couple of people I told, and it wasn't an issue in my family. There was a girlfriend I had at the time. I wasn't supposed to have a girlfriend in my days in the cult, and then once the cult found out, I had to break up with her, and they had to write her a terrible. So I wanted to explain to her what was going on at the time and why I broke up with her. And so she was one of the first people I got in touch with. There was another guy who with my brother had tried to do an intervention, a guy from Princeton, tried to get me out of the group, and I had been awful to both he and my brother, thinking that they were the ultimate betrayers. So I got in touch with him. And I was just scared to get in touch with my family because I thought this is going to be a tough one. But then I got someone called me about a comment on an article that's being written in the media, and then that article went online, and someone else saw it who conveyed it to my parents. And this is, I'd been out for a couple of years at this point, but like I said, it took me a year and a half before I could even identify it to be a cult. And it took me another probably 6 to 9 months before I actually had the conversation with my parents.
How did that conversation go?
It was great because, again, they were just happy that I was being honest and open to, to label it as what it was. And my mother in particular, because she had done a lot of homework, was very receptive. My brother, who had tried to do the intervention, he was very well versed in mind control, so he was very accepting. It took me a year and a half before I could even identify it to be a cult. And it took me another probably 6 to 9 months before I actually had the conversation with my parents. I'm actually doing a documentary now, and all my family's participated to try to tell a cautionary tale and really set the record straight on how these things happen, how it can happen to anybody. That it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can actually be, the silver lining can be, the lessons learned and rebuilding relationships in a way that actually end up becoming stronger. It's kind of like the prodigal son. When something's taken from you and you get it back, you almost appreciate it more. And so that's really been the case of what I've gone through.
Do you think, after all this time, sort of 18, 19 years after leaving the group, do you think you are free of it totally in your head and in your heart?
It's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. I always feel like a work in progress. I stay very active in the community to try to build awareness around cults. So for me, it's my biography, and I certainly will never be born at cocktail parties. I mean, I can drop the cult bomb at any moment, and you can't help or save someone else, but people help and save themselves. All you can do is facilitate their healing on some level, potentially by providing information. And it's really up to people to decide whether to assimilate that information or not. But I feel like, having gone through basically a survivor tale of sorts, there's a responsibility to share it, because those type of stories tend to provide information that help us alter our perspective.
You mentioned you've always got that up your sleeve at cocktail parties. Do you still go to parties with supermodels or kind of 1980s supermodels reunions?
Yeah, there have been a couple of reunions. It's always hilarious. I've got some great friends from that time, and I look back on it now, it feels like it was someone else's lifetime, and it doesn't even feel like it even happened. I guess that's what happens as you become an old chicken.
Old chicken. Hoyt Richards talking to me in 2018. His documentary is called Welcome to the Beyond. Thanks for listening. We'll have another extraordinary Outlook story for you tomorrow. Don't miss it. You're listening to Witness History on the BBC World Service. I'm Laura Fitzpatrick, and today I'm taking you back to August 1945 and the end of World War II.
Scientists, British and American, have made the atomic bomb at last. The first one was dropped on a Japanese city this morning.
The Allies had finally succeeded in forcing a Japanese surrender after dropping nuclear weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
20,000 tons of high explosives. That's 2,000 times the power of one of the RAF's 10-ton bombs of orthodox design.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low.
In Britain, victory in Japan was welcomed with celebrations in the streets.
I went over to Paisley Abbey where they were having a service of remembrance, because it wasn't so much remembrance, it was sort of saying hallelujah, the war was over in the Far East.
Margaret Foulds was a radio engineer working for the British Navy. She had signed up for the Women's Royal Naval Service while studying architecture in Glasgow.
Música nuevamente de Beethoven.
Inaugurate National Summit.
particularmente Rumanía en forma rotativa, dijo el secretario de Defensa Mark Esper. A medio camino de Bagdad, un viaje, lo comenta el país, un viaje de casi 17 horas en tren, la poesía de las estaciones centroeuropeas, la primera frontera dura de la Unión Europea, rumanos que regresan por la crisis y un iraquí en Rumanía. El Mercantil comenta que el Arces España amplía la red europea con servicios hacia Alemania, Rumanía y Polonia. Luego también otro periódico, Diario Vasco, se hace eco de la noticia con la que iniciábamos esta información de Rumanía a la prensa española. Solaris gana para CAF 3 contratos en Alemania, Polonia y Rumanía por más de 30 millones. Balotelli cerca de ir a jugar a Rumanía, una información de Olé desde Argentina. Y bueno, estas últimas informaciones de ahora, en más países europeos desaconsejan viajar a España por el aumento de contagios. Dinamarca fue el último país que se sumó. Diario de Cuyo desde Argentina. Bueno, y con esta información les dejamos con la programación de Radio Rumanía Internacional de cada lunes y también les invitamos a que nos escuchen cada día de la semana. Ha sido un honor para mí estar de nuevo con ustedes aquí en Radio Rumanía Internacional, con Rumanía en la prensa española. Les esperamos en 7 días, aquí como siempre en las antenas de RTI, y les deseamos mucha felicidad y si están de vacaciones que las disfruten. Bona nit, nocte buna. Muy buenas noches amigos oyentes de Radio Rumanía Internacional. La revedere.
A partir del 29 de marzo de 2020 y hasta el 25 de octubre de 2020, las emisiones en español por onda corta de Radio Rumanía Internacional se pueden sintonizar de este modo.
A las 19 horas UTC por 9.610 y 11.850 kHz en España.
A las 21 horas UTC por 11.650 y 9.610 DRM en Argentina y Brasil.
A las 23 horas UTC por 9.700 y 11.990 kHz en Sudamérica y por 9.760 y 11.800 kHz en Centroamérica.
A las 2 horas de la madrugada UTC por 9.510 y 11.945 kHz en Sudamérica y por 7.375 y 9.700 kHz en Centroamérica.
También se pueden sintonizar vía satélite Eutelsat 16A en 11.512 MHz, polarización vertical, azimut 16 grados este.
En Internet pueden escuchar nuestros programas en formato WMA Windows Media Audio en la página www.rri.ro.
Y también a través de TuneIn y en su teléfono móvil o fijo al precio de una llamada local en las condiciones de su plan tarifario llamando al número 1425394708 en Estados Unidos y 899-274-6668 en México.
Muchas gracias por su atención.